The Institute is a global research institute. It's definitely not looking at American exceptionalism, although I think there's an interesting project to be done on that concept and relating the two and weaving the word through both sides of that discussion. But exception, in the case of this in the Institute here, is a range of scenarios I'll describe. So thinking about when there's a crisis at a nation state level or a sub regional level. It could be nature based. It could be a hurricane or an earthquake, forest fires. It could be war. Uh, and what it does is it requires a government to make very fast decisions that it normally can't make, that there are normal guardrails protecting against. And many constitutions have formal emergency powers written into them. Not all of them, but many. And why? Because, sort of you look at the history of constitutions, what were they meant to do was try to change the dynamic of having, a sovereign that could say, jump up and down, being, basically people having no rights. Where the sovereign could just sort of use the people as they see fit, take their property, whatever. And what constitutions were meant to do was try to solidify human rights that were, unbreakable, that were baseline norms that everyone understood, so that a society could cohere, so that we wouldn't have a Hobbesian world. That I really, I mean, I enjoy reading Hobbes, and you have to think about when he's writing, because I find a lot very compelling with him, but you also have to think about when he's writing. And I think that constitutions as a concept are meant to try to get us to a better place and establish minimum standards that allow people to thrive. Um, but at the same time, like a crisis, an emergency can come out of nowhere, and we need to, in a gross simplification, reintroduce the sovereign temporarily to say, okay, I need to make a range of really quick decisions that normally I might need to go to the legislature and get approval for, but I need to do that to protect the society. And I'll give you acute examples that are easy to envision. Something as simple as a major hurricane or typhoon hits a city, and the city floods, and the government, the leader of the government declares an emergency and says, okay, first thing we need to do is put a curfew down. So basically, so that first responders and law enforcement can bring stability to the city and try to find people, and rescue them. And what you have there is an infringement of people's rights. Normally, they wouldn't have a limit on their freedom of movement, but in the case of an emergency, they might need to be constrained. So um, those kinds of scenarios happen all the time. We had a fire in Maui last year. You have fires in California. Hurricane Katrina a long time ago hitting. I'm speaking through a U.S. context of experiences, but obviously there's natural disasters all over the world. But what happens is effectively you need to suspend the balance of powers. You have to suspend aspects of rule of law temporarily to solve for the emergency. Now, many emergency powers will have time-bound constraints. They'll have something like, the leader declares an emergency, and they have 30 days of a range of exceptional powers. That's why it's called exception. So they have a range of exceptional powers that are often pre-agreed by the legislature and an executive of some prior administration to say, okay, these are the sort of parameters we operate within whenever there's an emergency. When that time period ends, the emergency powers cease to exist, and a leader, could make a petition to the legislature to extend it. And again, the parameters of these are often pre-arranged before a crisis, because you're not going to solve for this during a crisis. Um, that's how it's supposed to work, right? The challenge of exception is twofold. One, it kind of assumes noble actors, noble intent. If you have someone who's willing to outright fabricate a crisis, and the most recent example I like to talk about is what happened in South Korea in December of 2024. And you have the president there declaring martial law, um, and claiming assassination attempts, from the North Koreans. He had a range of narratives that he was trying to work with, all North Korea focused, um, to allow him to declare martial law. In reality, he and his wife were being investigated for corruption, and they were probably coming close to the end of their political lives and likely entering into criminal litigation. Um, so he declared martial law, and in the South Korean constitution, the legislature has to convene immediately after a declaration of martial law, and they give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down if they have a quorum. So the South Korean president deployed the military to prevent the legislature from convening. If you recall the news at the time, watching footage, the legislators were breaking in through the windows to get into the legislature to have a quorum. They were able to reach a quorum, and they voted. They basically voted martial law down, and they immediately voted to impeach the president. Both of those um, acts, those legal acts, had to work their way through the court process. And by April of 2025, both martial law in that instance was deemed improper, and the president was in fact impeached. And now you saw, a couple of weeks ago, he was sentenced to life in prison. So now, like, the punishment phase is been up. But that's an example. That's the first example that's problematic. Is you have basically a bad actor who just declares an emergency and uses it to be, to abuse his or her power. The second instance is, and there is a third instance, and I'm going to come to that in a second, but it really is related to the first and second. The second instance is um, when you have a real emergency, but the temptation is there to the leader to extend it, to misuse it, to not, to take the power that is granted to them and use it for things other than the emergency that they're trying to solve. And I'll, give like just a crisp example of it that's also current. You have the president in El Salvador, Bukele. They just started their fifth year. It gets approved, to like 30 days, re-upped every month. I think they're in their fifth year of a state of exception. And the terminology is important. There's a lot of different words. It could be a martial law, state of emergency, state of siege, state of exception. There's a lot of different words for it. Um, Depending on the constitution or depending on the case law in the country, because some of it is sort of organically formed by Supreme Court equivalent decisions. Um, but what happens, so in the Bukele example, you start to see that now he's talking about removing term limits for the presidency. Now, the underlying emergency that he declared the initial state of exception to solve for was the rampant gang violence. El Salvador, San Salvador was like one of the most dangerous cities on earth. Top 10 in violent crime. When he implemented that state of exception. So he's done a lot to solve the crime issue. Um, there's a lot of great analysis that will show you that it's overbroad. What the measures he's taken are heavily overbroad. Um, I took a trip to El Salvador and was speaking with a friend and who said, the kind of the word on the street is, and this was in what, 2023. The word on the street is Bukele has rounded up 150,000 of the 75,000 gang members, which was like made everyone chuckle, but at the same time you're like, okay, well, that's not funny. I mean, these are real people, and the impact of that is substantial. Um, so what does removing term limits have to do with solving for violent crime? There is no reason for him to be discussing removal of term limits, but it's happening. And so that's sort of the second example, is a legitimate emergency that gets sort of warped through the intention of a leader that has a temptation to take advantage of it. Um, the third thing I wanted to mention is in either of those scenarios, exceptionality, the idea of imbalance, bakes into systems. There's a lot of interesting scholarship on the war on terror, for example, that talks about, there was 9/11 happened. There was a range of changes to our law in response that allowed for response to basically prevent another attack. over time, a lot of the changes that were implemented kind of bake into our system. The authorities, the special authorities and things start to bake into our legal system, and then people start asking questions. Like, well, do we need to continue this? Why hasn't this been, why hasn't this piece of this sort of aged off? Um, and those are legitimate questions. And like I said, there's tremendous scholarship on that, and that was actually probably the topic that brought me into this field, my interest into this field. During COVID, when I was
Uh-huh.
on lockdown and at home, I basically read that over 30 days. And it was so compelling to read his argumentation on state of exception in the context of the war on terror. And having lived I said the first half of my career kind of inside it in one of the, hottest regions where we were active, the South Asian theater. Um, I saw everything from, inside under the hood, so to speak. And then to read, some theory that I felt was incredibly compelling and great at capturing it, like the risks, the risks of overreach and permanent, the permanent overreach. And then at the same time, I'm reading it during COVID, where we have, 190 or so states of emergency around the planet. Some of them run well, some run poorly, and some being weaponized. I was like, could not have had a brighter, like, aha moment. I'm like, this issue is remarkably important. And I think it's something that we need to be talking about. And as I started to like pull the threads on it, you start realizing that it's such a multidisciplinary issue. It's philosophy, it's political science, it's history, it's anthropology, it's law, it's sociology. There's so many different perspectives to look at these issues from. And it's not just a legal issue, or sorry, it's not just an academic issue. It's a very practical issue. As I mentioned, society like El Salvador has had an incredibly positive and negative impact at the same time on the society. And there's so many implications to that. So I wanted to create a research institute that um, examines this issue in every measure of complexity it has, but at the same time builds pathways to resilience. So what do I mean by that? Is like thinking about guardrails and thinking about um, I look at what I said before. If you look at in the United States, an individual states have their own constitutions. State constitutions have that structure in most cases that I described, where, the governor of the state can declare an emergency based on a certain set of parameters and has 30 days to execute certain authorities that are delineated. And at the end of those 30 days, they can't just say, I declare an emergency. They have to go to the legislature and say, I would like to extend this another 30 days. And it's 30 days. And the legislature then votes. So there's like an inherent check on the system right there. That's a guardrail. There's other, Lithuania recently declared an emergency related to the balloons, that are being flown from Belarus in or disrupting air traffic and just causing a lot of chaos. And what is interesting is when that emergency was declared, I see it's like the legislature declares the emergency, and it allowed for, it was very narrowly prescribed. It basically allowed for the military to augment the police who are sort of monitoring the border to ensure that there's detection and disruption of these balloons when they come across the border. So I was like, this is a very narrowly scoped emergency power, um, but it enhanced Lithuania's safety, and it was done in a manner that was, within the system. The legislature basically voted it into place, which I think is a really interesting system. Like, so that's a series of checks right there that I thought, like, that's a good model. And again, it may not be perfect, but as I'm examining this issue, I'm looking at different states and how they execute these powers and how they turn them on and how they turn them off. Right. That's really the key piece of this, more so how they turn them off. So part of what I would like to do with the institute is examine those distinctions, um, identify laws that make sense, highlight those, perhaps advocate that other countries like adopt certain types of structures, working with, as I mentioned before, it's so important to listen to people. We're trying to build a global community of people who are impacted by this so we can hear what they think. I know there's going to be similarly situated thinkers all over the world saying this issue is important and we should do more to manage it properly. So that's us in a nutshell.